There are houses that keep their secrets the way the earth keeps its dead, pressed down, buried underweight, silent for years, sometimes for generations. And then one day the floor gives way, not always in a dramatic way. Sometimes it is the slow groan of old wood, settling in the cold. Sometimes it is a hollow sound, under a heel that should not be hollow. Sometimes it is nothing more than a thin crack of light where no light should exist, just a pale line running along the grain of the floorboards, like a scar that never truly healed. That is how it started in the Hurrick house, not with thunder, not with shouting, not with fire, but with a quiet line of light. And what lay beneath that light? Beneath the dining room floor, where a family had shared their meals for decades, where children had grown up and elders had passed away, where prayers had been said and wine had been poured and daily life had moved on without any suspicion, was not at all what anyone imagined. What was hidden there changed everything, every meal, every prayer, every story the Harwick family had ever believed about themselves. This is not a myth. This is not folklore, passed through whispers and exaggeration. This is a recorded account put together from coroner records, county court papers, the personal diary of a woman who found the truth far too late, and the statement of a man who spent the last years of his life trying to make sure the world would never forget what happened in that house in Harlan County, Kentucky, in the year 1887. Pay close attention because every detail matters, and the details in this story are remarkable. Harlan County sits in the southeastern corner of Kentucky, pressed against the Virginia border by the ridges of the Cumberland Mountains that rise so steep and close together that the valleys between them receive only a few hours of direct sunlight each day, even in the peak of summer. It is the kind of land that shapes the people who live there. Heavy, close, watchful. The mountains do not protect, they observe. The town of Loyal, which would not be officially formed until 1912, was in 1887 little more than a small group of buildings placed without much planning along Martin's Fork Creek. A general store, a Methodist church, a grain mill, a blacksmith shop, the vat, Methodist church, a grain mill, and perhaps 40 households spread within walking distance of each other. The railroad had not yet reached the area. The coal companies had not yet come either, though they were on their way. Within a decade they would completely change Harlan County, removing its quiet isolation and filling the valleys with workers, machines, and ambition. But in 1887, none of that had happened yet. The county was still quiet in the way places become quiet when they have been left alone for a long time. The Harwick property sat on a low ridge about 1.5 miles north of the Loyal settlement, reached by a rough wagon path that followed the creek for most of its length before rising up a short slope and leveling out into a wide, uneven yard. The house itself was large for the area, 2 stories of hand-cut timber, with a stone base, a covered front porch, a separate kitchen building connected by a covered walkway, a root cellar dug into the hillside 20 yards from the back door, and several outbuildings in different conditions. It had been built in 2 stages. The original single-room structure dated back to the 1830s, while the larger addition, including the dining room, had been completed in the 1850s, according to a deed recorded in Harlan County in 1856. The property had passed through 3 owners before the Harwicks. The first was a man named Dunnar, who built the original structure and farmed a small area along the creek. He sold it in 1841 to a family named Slaggle, who expanded the outbuildings and added the kitchen walkway. The Slaggles kept it for 15 years before selling it to a man named Cord Harrick in the spring of 1856. Cord Harrick was 41 years old when he bought the property. He came to Harlan County from Letcher County, where he had briefly run a small tannery before a disagreement with a business partner, the details of which were never clearly stated, though it caused enough talk that Cord decided a new start in a nearby county was better than staying in Whitesburg. He arrived in Harlan County with a wagon, a wife named Eleanor, 3 children between the ages of 6 and 12, and a reputation that was neither good nor bad, simply unknown, which in a place where most men carried known family histories, gave him a strange and undefined presence. He was a man from somewhere else, a man without a local story. Eleanor Harwick was, by most reports, a capable woman, organized, direct, not overly social, but not unfriendly either. She managed the household with a quiet efficiency that is usually only noticed when it stops. She kept a garden and preserved her own food. She attended the Methodist Church regularly, though not with strong devotion. She had clear opinions and spoke them without hesitation, and if neighbors sometimes described her as reserved, it seemed more like a choice than her natural nature. She was always watching, always aware. Their children, 2 sons and a daughter, were Walter, age 12, Daniel, age 9, and Nora, age 6, when they moved to the property. By 1887, 31 years later, Walter was 43, married with children, and living 2 counties away in Bell County. Daniel had died of fever in 1872 at the age of 24. Nora, now Nora Harwick Prowett, married to a man named George Prate, was 37 years old and living 6 miles from the family home. Cord Harwick had died in the winter of 1881, leaving Eleanor alone in the house on the ridge. He was 66 years old. The official cause of death, according to the county doctor, was lung congestion. Eleanor buried him in the small family plot at the edge of the property, marked his grave with a stone she had paid a man in Loyal to carve, and continued living in the house. She was 72 years old in the spring of 1887. She had lived in that house for 31 years, and in all that time she had never suspected that the dining room floor was not what it seemed. It began on a morning in March. Eleanor woke early as she always did, a habit from years of farm life, rising before full daylight, moving through the house with the ease of someone who knew every board and corner by memory. She lit the fire in the kitchen stove, set water to heat, and walked through the covered passage to the dining room to get a small crock of dried beans she had left on the sideboard the night before. As she crossed the floor, she heard it, a hollow sound, not quite a knock, not quite an echo, but something between, coming from under her right foot. With each step she took across one specific part of the floor near the center of the room. She stopped, stepped back, then stepped forward again. The sound returned, clearer this time, a faint but certain hollowness that did not match the solid sound of the rest of the floor. She stood there for a moment, pressing her weight down, listening carefully. It was not the sound of a settling house. Eleanor had lived in old homes long enough to recognize that. This was different. This was the sound of empty space beneath pressure, the sound of something hollow because it was meant to be whole. Low, not because it had worn down or shifted. She lowered herself onto her hands and knees. The floorboards in the dining room were wide oak planks, darkened by age and years of cleaning, fitted so tightly together that in most places it would have been hard to slide even a knife blade between them. But when Eleanor leaned closer to the section that made the hollow sound, she noticed something she had never seen before. Later, she would say she could not understand how she had missed it for so long, because once noticed, it seemed obvious. The grain pattern of the boards in that central area did not match the grain of the boards around it. They were the same wood, the same width, the same color, shaped by years of use and cleaning, but the grain ran differently. The surrounding boards had long flowing patterns, full of natural curves and variation. The central section, about 4 by 3 feet as she would later estimate, had straighter, tighter grain, more even, as if the boards had been cut from a different tree or prepared for a different purpose, and then placed there to match as closely as possible. She ran her fingers along the edges of the section. The gap between the central boards and the rest of the floor was extremely fine, almost impossible to see, but it was there, a thin line running along all 4 sides, a door. Eleanor Harwick was kneeling on the floor of her dining room in a house she had lived in for 31 years, and she was looking at a hidden door in the floor that she had never known was there. She sat back for a long time. Then she stood, walked out of the room, left the house, and walked 6 miles to her daughter's home, without saying a word about what she had discovered until she arrived. George Putt was a practical man, a builder by trade, careful and methodical, not given to imagination or dramatic ideas. He was 39 years old in 1887, 6 feet tall, odd-shouldered, with steady hands shaped by years of working with wood and understanding its nature. He had been married to Nora for 14 years. He respected his mother-in-law. He believed she was sensible and trusted her judgment. When Eleanor reached their door and told him she had found something unusual beneath the dining room floor, George did not ask many questions. He put on his coat. They reached the Harwick house in the early afternoon, George and Nora together. George carried his tool bag, which he had brought out of habit from his work. If there was a floor panel that needed to be lifted, he would need the proper tools to do it without harming the surrounding boards. In the dining room, Elena showed him the section. George got down on his knees, ran his hands across it the same way she had, pressed down, and listened to the hollow sound that came back. Then he took a thin, bladed tool from his bag, worked it carefully along the edge of the section, and confirmed what Eleanor had already discovered. The separation was clean and exact. This was not a gap caused by shrinking wood or poor joinery. It was a constructed joint made to fit tightly. He worked in a steady way, clearing the gap on all 4 sides, testing with his fingers for any locking device, any peg or pin that might be holding it in place. He found nothing on the north side, nothing on the east. On the south, near the middle of that edge, his finger pressed against something that gave slightly, a small recessed tab built into the underside of the panel, invisible from above, unless you were searching for it. He pressed it. The panel shifted. Not much, maybe a 1/4 inch, but enough to break the tight seal. George looked up at Nora and Elena. Neither of them said a word. He gripped the edge of the panel with both hands and lifted. The panel was hinged on the north side. A pair of heavy iron hinges set so deeply into the wood that they had been completely hidden from above. It swung up and over, settling against the floor with a slow, controlled motion that told George at once this was skilled work. The hinges had been made to carry the weight of the panel without bending, to move it smoothly without catching, and to let it stay open without falling shut. Beneath the panel was a framed opening, about 3 feet by 2.5 feet. Beneath the panel was a framed opening, about 3 feet by 2.5, with the frame fitted into the surrounding floor so solidly that it could have held the full weight of a table and chairs placed directly on top without any movement. And below the opening, dropping down into darkness, was a staircase. Cut stone steps, narrow and steep, descending at a sharp angle into complete blackness. The 3 of them knelt at the edge and looked down. The air that rose from below was cold and still, and carried with it a faint, complicated smell that none of them could immediately name. Old earth, certainly, and stone, and something else, something without a clear name, something that settled at the back of the throat and stayed there. "How far does it go?" Nora asked. George brought a candle from the kitchen. He held it at the opening and watched the flame. It bent slightly. There was a draft from below, barely noticeable, which meant the space at the bottom connected to outside air somewhere. He counted the steps visible within the candlelight. 7. And then darkness. He looked at Elena. "Did your husband ever mention anything about this?" Elena's expression was not what either of them expected. It was not surprise. It was not confusion. It was something harder to understand than either of those. She was looking at the opening in her floor with an expression that George Pute would later describe in his statement before the Harlan County Court as recognition without understanding. "No," she said quietly. He never spoke of it. And then, after a pause, she said something else, something that George would repeat many times in the weeks that followed, and that would become one of the most often quoted lines in the county records connected to this case. "But I think I know what it is." To understand what Eleanor believed she had found, and to understand why she believed it, it is necessary to step back from the house on the ridge and look at the wider landscape in which it stood. Harlan County, Kentucky, sits in a particular geographic and historical position, surrounded by mountains that made large-scale plantation farming difficult. The county had never developed the kind of slave economy that defined the bluegrass region and much of the central and western parts of the state. Farms in Harlan County were small and self-sustaining. Slaveholding, while it existed, was limited. The 1850 census recorded fewer than 120 enslaved persons in the entire county, spread across about 20 households, most of them holding 2 or 3 individuals, rather than the dozens or hundreds seen in plantation counties to the north and west. This did not mean Harlan County was free from conflict over the issue of slavery. The closeness to Virginia, the state line running barely 15 miles east of Loyal, created a particular kind of tension that was different from plantation regions, but no less important. The mountains that isolated Harlan County from broader state and national life also created a passage. The ridgelines and creek valleys of the Cumberland Mountains had long been traveled by people moving without permission, people who had decided, at great personal risk, that the life given to them was not the one they would accept. The route through Harlan County was not one of the formally recorded pathways of the Underground Railroad. Those more organized networks usually ran through the center, and western parts of the state, through Louisville and Lexington and the river crossings to the north. What moved through the southeastern mountains was something more informal, more improvised, more dependent on individual choices made in darkness and silence. People in these mountains helped runaways, not because they belonged to any system. People in these mountains helped runaways not because they belonged to any system, not because they were given instructions or payment, but because, when someone appeared at their door in the night, hungry and afraid, some people opened the door and some people did not. The Harwick House stood on a ridge with long sight lines in 3 directions. It was 1.5 miles from the nearest settlement. It had a root cellar and several outbuildings. It sat along a route that, if a person were traveling north through the mountains on foot, would be a reasonable stopping place. What Eleanor had suspected for a very long time, and what she had never asked Court directly, and what Court had never told her, was that the man she had married had been, at some point before their life together in Harlan County, involved in something he had reason to hide. Not a criminal matter exactly, not the kind of thing that left records in the usual sense, but a past, a buried one. She had pieced it together over 30 years from things that should not have fit together as neatly as they did. A conversation she had overheard in the summer of 1858, when a man she did not recognize arrived at the property after dark and left before sunrise, and the expression on Court's face as he watched him go. A passage in Court's personal journal, which she found after his death, that referred to arrangements, and the lower passage in terms too unclear to fully understand, but too precise to dismiss. The behavior of their dog, a large, mixed hound named Barker, who had spent several nights in the late 1850s and early 1860s stationed at the north end of the dining room with an alertness she had at the time blamed on something digging under the house. She had believed something was there. She had not known its shape, and now she did. George Pitt went down the stairs first with a lantern. He moved slowly, placing his feet carefully on the cut stone steps, testing each one before putting his full weight down. The stairs were solid. The stone was dry and steady, the edges still sharp, showing little sign of wear. Someone had cut and set them with care, and whoever had done it knew their craft well. There were 11 steps in total. George counted as he went down. At the bottom, the lantern's light spread into a low ceiling chamber cut directly into the earth and stone of the ridge. The walls were supported with timber, old timber, dark with age, fitted against the stone with wooden wedges driven into the gaps to keep it from collapsing. The floor was bare earth, packed hard and smooth. The ceiling, held by the same timber framework that lined the walls, was about 6 feet at its highest point, sloping slightly toward the back of the space. The chamber was about 12 feet long and 8 feet wide. It was not empty. Against the far wall, arranged with a care that was clear even to someone who did not yet understand what they were seeing, were several items. A wooden pallet raised off the earth floor on 2 low runners, the kind of simple sleeping platform that could be built in an afternoon from rough boards. An iron hook fixed into the wall, from which hung 2 folded wool blankets that had aged to the color of old tea. On the ground beneath the hook, a tin cup and a tin plate, their surfaces evenly worn with oxidation. A wooden box, low and flat, about the size of a small trunk, sitting against the east wall with its lid closed, and in the corner nearest the stairs, pressed into the angle where the east wall met the south wall, as if play. Said there with thought about its usefulness, a small iron stove, no more than 2 feet high, with a pipe that rose into the ceiling and disappeared, not through the floor of the dining room above, as George had first expected, but through the stone of the ridge itself, exiting, as George would later confirm, at a point about 15 feet east of the house, where the chimney's outlet was hidden behind a thick growth of rhododendron that had spread across the hillside over many years. George stood in the middle of the chamber and slowly turned, holding the lantern, and he understood what he was looking at. This was a room made for human living, built with purpose and care, designed to stay hidden, prepared for someone to remain there for an extended time. The stove vented sideways through the mountain instead of upward so that smoke would not appear above the house. The staircase was hidden beneath a floor panel made to be invisible. The chamber itself was cut deep enough into the ridge that no sound from within would reach the surface. Someone had built this room so that people could stay in it without anyone above or outside realizing they were there. He climbed back up the stairs. Nora and Eleanor were sitting at the dining room table. Neither of them had spoken since he went down. "There is a room," he said, "a real room with a sleeping platform and a stove. The stove vents out through the hill." Nora looked toward her mother. Eleanor was staring at the open panel in the floor. "How old is it?" Nora asked. "The timber is very old," George said. "The stove is cast iron. Could be 20, 30 years old. Could be even older." He paused. "There are still blankets down there." Eleanor said nothing. George sat down. He set the lantern on the table. He looked at his mother-in-law for a long moment. "Mrs. Harwick," he said, "what do you know about this room?" Eleanor looked up. Her eyes were clear and steady, the way they always were. But beneath that clarity, there was something else, a kind of tiredness perhaps, or a weight that had been carried for many years and was only now being set down. "I know it was there before we came," she said. "The room was already there when Cord bought this house. The Slaggles built it, or had it built sometime in the 1840s. She paused. "I believe it was used for what you think it was used for, and I believe it was used even after we arrived, though Court never said it to me directly." Nora stared at her mother. "Why did you never ask him?" Eleanor was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Because there are things you do not put into words, things that are safer left in silence. I knew what the room was in the way you know things you have never been told. And I knew that knowing it directly, having it spoken aloud, having it turn into a conversation, would put all of us in danger." She folded her hands on the table. "Those were different times. You were children." George went back down. He needed to see what was inside the box. Nora followed him this time, even though he objected lightly. She came down carefully, holding the wall, and stood beside him in the low chamber while he crouched in front of the wooden box against the east wall. It was not locked. The lid was held by 2 simple iron clasps that had rusted to the color of dried blood, and George opened them with effort, the metal stiff and resistant. After years of cold and damp air, inside was a collection of items arranged with clear care, not thrown in, not scattered, but placed as if someone had thought about each piece and chosen its place with purpose. On top lay a folded piece of oilcloth, which George lifted and set aside. Beneath it was a thin leather-bound book about the size of a man's palm, its cover worn smooth at the edges, and the leather cracked along the spine. George opened it carefully. The pages were handwritten. The ink had faded to a pale brown. The handwriting changed, sometimes neat and careful, sometimes cramped and hurried, as if written under different conditions at different times. It was some kind of record. Dates, initials, directions, numbers that might have been distances, directions, numbers that might have been distances, directions, numbers that might have been distances. names of places, creeks, ridges, the occasional settlement name, and at intervals what looked like simple shorthand notes, pairs of initials, sometimes a single word, sometimes nothing but a small mark that could have been a tick or a cross. George could not understand most of it. Not because the writing was unclear, but because whatever system the writer had used to record these things was not self-explaining. It had not been written for any future reader. It had been written as a private memory aid, understandable only to someone who already knew what the entries referred to. Beneath the book was a small group of folded papers, documents of different kinds. George opened each one carefully. The first was a torn half-sheet of paper, on which someone had drawn a rough map showing a trail through what looked like mountain land, with compass directions marked, and 2 or 3 landmarks written in a handwriting that did not match the journal. The map had been handled many times. The fold lines were deep and soft, the edges worn down. The second was part of a letter, the top half missing, starting in the middle of a sentence, and if you find yourself unable to continue before the weather turns, the lower room will hold you comfortably for as long as needed. The stove can be vented without being seen. You will find everything necessary. God keep you safe. There was no signature. The paper was water-stained and fragile. The handwriting was that of an educated person. The letters formed carefully, the language chosen with care. The third document was the one that stopped both George and Nora completely. It was a full letter on better quality paper than the others, dated April 14th, 1857, addressed to no named person, but beginning with the words, "To whoever uses this place after me." The handwriting was precise and calm, the ink darker than the other documents, suggesting it had been written more recently than the rest. George read it aloud slowly in the lantern light. "To whoever uses this place after me, I do not know your name, and you do not know mine. That is as it should be. The less we know of one another, the safer we are. But I have found myself unable to leave this place without writing something, without leaving some record that this room existed, and what it was used for, even if that record is never read by anyone who is not already here. This room was built in the year 1847 by a man whose name I will not write. He built it for the purpose you understand. In the years between its building and this writing, it has been used 7 times to my knowledge. The number of persons who have passed through it is 17. I have confirmed 9 safe arrivals. Of the other 8, I have no certain knowledge. I am writing this because I am leaving this county. The situation of my leaving is such that I do not expect to return. The house above has been sold. I do not know the new owner or his sympathies. I have taken what I could carry. I leave the room as it is, with the hope that whoever comes after will understand its purpose and choose what to do. I leave only one instruction. There is a second room. I will not describe where it is. If you need it, you will find it. If you do not need it, it is better that you do not know. May God grant mercy to everyone who has ever taken shelter in this darkness, and to everyone who chose to keep the light on for them." The letter ended there. George folded it and held it for a low, NG moment without speaking. "A second room," Nora said. George nodded. They looked at each other in the lantern light in the low stone chamber beneath the dining room floor, and neither of them said what both of them were thinking. The discovery was reported to the Harlan County Sheriff 3 days after George found the panel in the floor. The delay was deliberate. Elena had asked for time, and George and Nora had agreed without fully saying why. There was an instinct at work that none of them could easily explain, a feeling that the room and what it held existed in a part of history that was not fully theirs to reveal, that whatever choice they made about the staircase and what lay at the bottom of it carried a weight that needed careful thought. By 1887, slavery had been abolished for 22 years. The Civil War had been over for the same amount of time. The Underground Railroad, to the extent it had ever been openly acknowledged, was by then becoming the subject of memory and respect, rather than criminal investigation. The legal danger of having sheltered runaway slaves had not existed for a generation. But the personal histories connected to it were another matter. The previous owner of the house, the man who had sold it to Court Harwick in 1856, was named Rufus Slagle. Rufus Slagle was dead. His son, a man named Clarence Slagle, was not. He was 61 years old and lived 4 miles from Loyal. He was by all accounts a well-known and respected member of the county community. He had served 2 terms on the county court. His family was known and regarded. The letter in the box had said this room was built in the year 1847 by a man whose name I will not write. It had said the house above has been sold. I do not know the new owner or his sympathies. It had not named Rufus Slagle, but the timing was exact. The room had been built in 1847 when the Slagles owned the property. The letter had been written in 1857 when the Slagles had just sold it to Court Harwick. The writer of the letter, whoever they were, had been closely familiar with the room and its past, and they had been connected with the property at or just before the time of the sale. George had no desire to start a county-wide dispute about a past that could not be changed. Neither did Eliana, who had lived beside whatever that history was for 31 years and had made her own choice about silence. Nor, in truth, did Nora, who understood in her own way that what was in that room was not a crime but an act of conscience, and that whatever came next had to be handled with care. What forced the issue was not moral duty or legal pressure. It was the second room, because in the 3 days between George going down into the chamber and the formal report to the sheriff, George had gone back again. He had studied the walls of the chamber more closely. He had spent an afternoon with the lantern, running his hands along every inch of the timber supports, and he had found the second room. It was not obvious. That must be said clearly. Whoever had built it had not wanted it to be obvious, and they had done their work well. The join was invisible to the eye. The timber supports along the east wall appeared, to any normal inspection, firm and unbroken. The wedges pushed into the spaces between the beams were even and believable. What revealed it, what George discovered after 2 hours of slow and careful checking, was a slight thermal difference. He noticed it with his hand, not with his eyes. Moving along the east wall with his palm pressed flat against the wood, he found a section about 4 feet wide and 5 feet high, where the temperature of the timber felt noticeably different from the parts on either side. Cooler, not sharply, not truly cold, but enough that when his focus shifted to temperature instead of sight, it felt wrong. Cold usually enters a structure from the outside. The east wall of the lower chamber was built against solid stone ridge. There was no outside opening, no window, no clear source of outside air, and yet the middle of that wall felt cooler than the areas beside it. George took out his blade and ran it along the lower edge of the 4 feet section. Just as he had done with the panel in the floor above, he found the same result. A crafted joint fitted so tightly, it was almost invisible. From there, he worked up the sides and across the top. The panel measured roughly 4 feet wide and 5 feet high, hinged at the top, in a way that made it swing inward rather than outward when released. He located the release point, a recessed pin on the left side, and pressed it. The panel swung inward quietly on well-kept hinges. Behind it was another passage, not a room this time, but a tunnel low and narrow, about 4.5 feet high, and just over 2 feet wide, supported with smaller beams and fitted stone, running east and then bending slightly north, fading out of the lantern's reach after around 15 feet. George stood at the opening for a long while. The draft he had noticed during his first descent, the faint movement of air in the main chamber, was stronger here. It came from the tunnel. The tunnel connected somewhere to outside air. The temperature difference he had felt in the east wall was the outside cold, moving through the tunnel and passing through the timber supports. He stepped inside. The tunnel extended about 40 feet before opening into a third space, smaller than the first chamber, around 6 feet by 6 feet, with a timber ceiling just high enough to stand under if a person was not too tall. It held no furniture, no tools, almost nothing at all. The floor was bare earth. The walls were stone and wood, almost nothing. On the ground in the center of that small space lay a collection of items that George could not at first understand as a single scene. Only after he crouched beside them with the lantern and spent several minutes studying did he realize what he was seeing. There were shoes, a pair of small shoes, clearly a child's, made of leather, the soles worn thin, the uppers cracked and stiff with age. Next to them was a small folded piece of cloth. George opened it. It was a child's nightcap, the kind of soft cotton cap an infant or toddler might wear to sleep. Its fabric faded to the color of old ivory, and beneath the cloth, resting on the bare earth, was a small wooden cross no more than 8 inches long, made from 2 sticks of nearly equal size, tied together with a piece of twine. The twine had been tied with a certain kind of care. It was not just for function. The cross would have held without it. It had been tied the way someone ties something when they are taking time, when the act itself carries meaning. George sat in that second space, 40 feet from the main chamber, 100 feet from the house above, deep inside the center of a Kentucky ridge, and held the lantern over those objects for a long time. Then he placed them back exactly as he had found them. He marked the position of each item with small stones before moving them, so he could return them precisely. He did not know why this felt important. It simply did. Then he went back through the tunnel, into the main chamber, up the stone steps, and told his wife and her mother what he had discovered. Sheriff Aldous Crane of Harlan County was 54 years old, born in the county, was 54 years old, born in the county, a man who had served as sheriff for 11 years, and who, during those years, had developed a way of thinking about complexity that he explained when asked in these terms. Some things are finished, and the best thing you can do is understand them properly before you set them aside. He came to the Harwick house on a Thursday morning in late March, accompanied by his deputy, a young man named Frederick Patton, who was 23 years old and had been made deputy 6 months earlier. Crane arrived, saw the panel, went down the steps, walked the tunnel to the second space, and spent about 40 minutes in the underground areas before returning. He sat in Elena Harwick's kitchen and drank the coffee she set before him, and did not speak for several minutes. Then he asked Eleanor 3 questions. The first, "Did your husband ever tell you anything about this room before he passed away?" Eleanor said, "No, not directly." The second, "Did you notice at any time while living in this house that the room was being used?" Eleanor said, "Once. In the autumn of 1860, I heard something I believed was beneath the dining room floor. At night, I thought it was an animal." She paused. "I did not look into it." The third, "Is there anyone in this county who you believe might know how this room was used?" Eleanor looked at him steadily. "I have my suspicions," she said, "but I would not speak without being sure." Crane nodded. He turned to George. "The papers in the box, you have read them all?" "Yes," George said, "and I would like to give them to you as they are." "Good." Crane wrapped his hands around his cup. "I will need to examine the history of this property more closely. The previous owners, the Slaggles. I know the family." He paused again. "I know Clarence." The name settled in the room for a moment without comment. Frederick Crane said to his deputy, "I want you to go through the county deed records this week. Everything connected to this property from when it was built, sales, surveys, anything else." He looked at George. "And I want you to leave that room exactly as it is. Do not take anything. Do not move anything. Whatever is down there, it is part of a history that I intend to record properly." George nodded. Crane finished his coffee. He stood, put on his hat, and walked to the door. He paused there and turned back. "Mrs. Harwick," he said, "you have lived in this house for 31 years. "I have," Elena said. "And you never knew?" "I suspected," she said, "but I never knew." Crane was quiet for a moment. "There is a difference," he said. "Sometimes an important one." And then he left. Clarence Slaggle was, by all outward signs, a successful man. His father, Rufus, had been a farmer of moderate means, comfortable, not rich, respected in the county in the way men who attend church and pay their debts often are, without standing out in any special way. Clarence had risen well beyond his father's position. He had studied law in Barberville, returned to Harbin County in his 20s, built a practice, and married well. His wife was a woman named Hattie, whose father had owned a large amount of land on Clover Fork, and over the years he had become a man of real local importance. He had served on the county court. He had helped organize the Methodist congregation's new building fund. He gave support to the Loyal Union Academy, the small subscription school that served the local area. When travelers passed through and asked who the leading men of the county were, his name was mentioned. He dressed well, spoke clearly, and remained fully in control of himself in public. He had, in the language of the time, the quality of a man who had decided exactly who he wanted to be and had carried out that decision without visible effort. Sheriff Crane visited him on the last Tuesday of March, 9 days after the first report. He went alone, without Frederick Patton, which was not the usual method for a formal visit, but which Crane had decided was suitable given the nature of the matter. He drove his buddy to the Slagle property, a fine place on the south side of Harlan Town with a neat yard and a painted fence. Hattie Slagle met him at the door and led him to the parlor where Clarence was reading. The two men had known each other for more than 10 years. They were not close friends. Their circles did not fully overlap, but they knew each other in the way that public men in small counties naturally do, with a shared familiarity built on respect and careful distance. Crane sat in the chair offered to him and did not begin with small talk. He told Clarence about what had been found at the Harwick house. He described the chamber, the tunnel, the second space. He mentioned the papers in the box. He watched Clarence's face the entire time. Clarence's face was remarkable in its control. It showed, in order, the expressions that a guilty man with long practice might display when hearing news he had partly expected, but hoped never to face. First, a look of measured surprise, carefully balanced, not too dramatic, not too slight. Then a look of serious thought, fitting the weight of what he was hearing. Then a slight lean forward, the posture of interest of a man following a story, rather than fearing it. It was a very skilled performance. Crane, who had observed many such performances in his work, thought it was among the better ones he had seen. He allowed Clarence to complete it. Then he said, "The letter in the box says the room was built in 1847 by a man whose name is not given. Your family owned this property from 1841 to 1856. Your father was Rufus Sluggle. Did your father ever mention this room to you?" Clarence's expression settled into one of honest regret. "I never knew about any room," he said. "My father died when I was 22. Whatever he might have done on that property, he never spoke about it with me." "Is that right?" Crane said. "It was not really a question. I cannot speak to what my father did or did not do before. I was old enough to understand such matters," Clarence said. "If you are asking whether I have any direct knowledge of that room, or how it was built, the truthful answer is no." Crane looked at him quietly for a moment. "What about later, after you became an adult, after your father's death?" A pause. Very short, very controlled. "What do you mean?" "I mean," Crane said, "that your father died in 1867. The property had already been sold to Court Harwick in 1856, but there was a gap of 11 years between your father's death and now. 11 years during which you were a grown man in this county, familiar with the history of that property, and during which, based on what Mrs. Harwick told me, the room may have been used at least once." He leaned forward slightly. A man who knew such a room existed might have reason to find out if it was still available, even after the property changed owners. Another pause, this one a little longer. "I have nothing more to add to what I have already told you," Clarence said. His voice stayed calm, his eyes steady. He had decided exactly how far this conversation would go. Crane recognized that decision. He nodded, stood up, thanked Clarence for his time, and drove back to his office in Loyal. That evening, he wrote in his official logbook, called on C. Slagle, regarding HR discovery. Slagle denies knowledge of room or its construction, denies any involvement after death of Father I.S. in 1867. Credibility of denial uncertain. No documentary evidence to contradict at present. Matter requires further inquiry. He underlined the last sentence. The further inquiry came from an unexpected place. Walter Harwick, El Leone's oldest son, living in Bell County, arrived in Harland County 10 days after the first discovery. He had received a letter from Nora describing what had been found, and he came in the way an eldest child of aging parents often does when something serious happens, dutiful but slightly delayed, carrying practical concern and a quiet sense of guilt about the distance between Bell County and Harland County, bearing the weight of family duty not perfectly met. He was 43 years old, heavier than before, with the careful behavior of a man who had spent 20 years running a mill and had learned that mistakes in a mill cost fingers. He was not a man of imagination. He did not deal in mystery or guesswork. He preferred records and proof. He had brought from his home in Bell County something he had not mentioned in any letters. It was his father's journal, not the aid memoir from the box under the floor. That had been a record kept by whoever used the hidden room before the Harwicks came. This was something different. A personal journal that Court Harwick had kept for much of his life, which Walter had found among his father's belongings after Court died in 1881, and which he had kept without reading, perhaps out of instinct, or maybe fear that it held things he was not ready to know. He had finally read it during the journey from Bell County to Harland County, riding in the back of a hired wagon over 2 days on a rough mountain road. He handed it to Sheriff Crane on the morning he arrived. Crane read it in his office over the next day and a half. The journal covered about 25 years, from the mid-1850s to the late 1870s. Court Harwick had not been a writer. His entries were short and factual, more like an account book than a confession, noting weather, business dealings, crop yields, and sometimes brief remarks on local events. But running through these practical notes, appearing now and then like a quiet current under still water, there was something more. Court Harwick had known about the room from the day he bought the house, not because Rufus Slagle told him during the sale. The journal made it clear no such conversation had happened. The discovery had been his own, made within the first week of living there, when he found the floor panel while repairing the dining room. He had understood immediately what the room was. He had gone down, seen the sleeping platform, the stove, the tunnel, and then he had made a choice. He left everything exactly as it was. The journal recorded, in its careful and indirect shorthand, 4 more uses of the room after the Harwicks moved in. 4 times between 1857 and 1863, Court Harwick opened a panel in his dining room floor and allowed people to go down into the hidden space beneath. He brought food in the evenings. He kept the stove burning in winter. He stayed awake at night, listening, knowing that if what he was doing was discovered, it could cost him everything. He did not record names. Not once in those 4 entries did he write the name of anyone who stayed hidden in his house. The entries were brief, almost broken. Room occupied 3 days. Departed north. Cold weather. Roof. Repaired Friday. And the careful choice to leave things out was itself a kind of record, showing a man who understood exactly the risk he was taking. The last entry about the room was dated November 1863. It was the longest of the 4, and unlike the others, it carried something close to emotion. Last time. I think the road has changed, and I do not know the new contacts. Rufus's boy came to see me last autumn about a matter he would not say clearly, and I told him clearly that I did not know what he meant, and he left. I believe he was testing me. I will not be tested. What is in this house is in this house, and it is mine to decide what becomes of it. I have thought sometimes about writing everything I know, the full account, every name I remember, every direction I gave, every night I stayed awake listening. I have decided against it, each time. Those people do not need their story written in a paper that can be found. They carried their own stories. They took them north where they belong. I will say only this. The room served. It served 11 people over 6 years. of which 2 I know reached where they intended to go, and the rest I could only pray for. 11 people. That is a number I will carry until I die. The room is still there. I do not know what I will do with it in the end. Some things are meant to remain. Crane set the journal down on his desk and sat with it for a long time. Then he went to find Walter Harwick. Rufus's boy came to see me last autumn about a matter he would not say clearly. That line from Court Harwick's journal became the center point of the investigation. Crane had already noticed during his visit to Clarence Slagle what he had written as credibility of denial uncertain. He now had a man who had come to the Harwick property, possibly in 1862 or 1863 based on the journal, asking about something he would not explain directly. A man who had grown up on that same property, whose father had owned it when the room was first built. A man who, when asked directly, claimed no knowledge of the room at all. If Clarence had visited Court Harwick in 1862 or 1863, which would have made him about 37 or 38 years old at the time, and if his purpose had been what Court's firm dismissal suggested, then the question remained why. By 1862, the Civil War was in its second year. The issue of slavery, which had been debated for decades as a moral and political matter, was now also decided with gunfire and armies. Harland County, like much of the mountain south, was deeply divided, not along simple geographic lines that later memory might suggest, but within communities and even within families. Some men went south to join Confederate forces. Others joined the Union. Many chose neither, trying to stay neutral in a time when neutrality was becoming impossible. The room beneath the Harwick dining room had been built to help people moving north. Whether it continued to serve that purpose after 1861, and under what conditions, was now both a moral and legal question in ways it had not been before the war. What had Clarence Slagle wanted from Court Harwick in the autumn of that wartime year? Iyade Crane thought about this for a long time before choosing how to proceed. He returned to Clarence Slagle. This time he brought Frederick Patton. He also brought a copied passage from Court's journal, not the original, which he had kept safely as evidence, but an exact handwritten copy. He sat in Clarence's parlor in the same chair as before, and he read the passage aloud. Clarence listened without showing any expression. The journal identifies you as the man who visited Court Harwick in the autumn of 1862 or 1863 and asked about a matter you would not explain clearly. Court Harwick believed you were asking about the room. He told you he did not know what you were talking about. Clarence replied, I have no memory of any such visit. Do you have no memory? Crane asked carefully. Or are you saying it never happened? There was a pause. Those are not the same thing, Crane said. Clarence Slagle looked at the sheriff of Harland County for a long time. He was 61 years old. A man of status and respect, someone who had spent his whole adult life building a name he had reason to protect. He had a wife, grown children, a profession, a name that carried weight in the county. He also, Crane believed, had a past, not exactly a criminal one, not something that would stand in any court of 1887, but a personal past, a story of choices made and things left unsaid, that was far more complex than the public man sitting in the parlor would have wanted it to be. What is it you want from me? Clarence said. His voice stayed calm, still controlled, but the act had fallen away. He was simply asking a plain question. The truth, Crane said. As much of it as you know, not for prosecution. There is nothing to prosecute. The war has been over for 20 years and the law has changed in every way that matters. I want the truth because there is a history in those 2 rooms that deserves to be fully understood, and you are one of the few people still alive who might be able to provide the pieces I am missing. Clarence looked out the window. A long, quiet moment passed. His hands, resting on his knee, did not move. My father built that room, he said. I was 14 years old. I helped carry the timber down. I thought we were building a second cellar for storage. He paused. He told me the truth. 3 years later, I was 17. He took me down and explained what the room was, what it had been used for, and why. He paused again. My father was a complicated man. In many ways, he was a man of his time, which means there were things he accepted without question that I now know were wrong. But the room was something he did with full awareness, and he was not ashamed of it. Did he ever tell you how many people had used it? He said 17 over 7 years, but he said that number carefully. He was unsure about some of them. 17, the same number written in the letter found in the box. And when you went to see Court Harwick, Crane said. Clarence was quiet for a moment. My father had died the year before in 1861. I had known when the house was sold to Harwick in 56 that the room was still there. I did not know Harwick's views. In 62, when the war had been going on for a year and things in the mountains were complicated, I wanted to know if the room was still being used. Not to stop it. I wanted to know if it was still in use because I had information about routes and contacts that might be useful to anyone using it. He stopped. Harwick did not trust me. I cannot say I blame him. I was Slagle's son, and I was a lawyer, and there was no reason for him to believe anything I said. He told me he did not know what I was talking about and showed me the door. After that, nothing. The war ended. Everything changed. He looked back at Crane. There was a child, he said. Crane was still. In the second room, Clarence said. The one at the end of the tunnel. In 1849, when I was 23, a woman and a child came. The child was very young, maybe 2 years old. The woman had carried the child all the way from Carter County, Virginia, almost 90 miles. She arrived at our property in the middle of a cold October night. He stopped. The child died, he said, 3 days after arriving. From the cold and the exhaustion of the journey. The woman, I do not know her name. My father never told me. She stayed 2 more days and then went north. My father buried the child in the second room. He did not mark it above ground because he could not risk anyone finding it and asking questions. He placed a cross and the child's belongings down there, pressed the earth over them, and that was the burial. George Pute, during his second descent into the small room at the end of the tunnel, had found shoes, a nightcap, and a cross tied with twine. He had put them back exactly as they were. Do you know if the woman survived? Crane asked. No, Clarence said. My father never found out. He looked for years. He never learned what happened. The letter in the box, addressed to whoever would use the place after, had been dated April 14th, 1857. The Slagle family had sold the property to Court Harwick in the spring of 1856. The letter had been written a year after the sale, meaning it had not been written by Rufus Slagle. He no longer owned the house and would not have had access to the room. Crane had noticed this difference from the beginning, but had kept it in mind, waiting for the investigation to reveal a likely writer. When he read the letter again after speaking with Clarence, he noticed something more clearly than before: the handwriting. He now had 3 documents written in the same hand: the journal from the box, the small record of routes and initials and directions, the fragment of a letter beginning with "and, if you find yourself unable to proceed before the weather turns," and the full letter addressed to whoever would use the place after. The same person had written all 3, and that person had not been Rufus Slagle, because Crane had found a deed signed by Rufus Slagle in the county records, and the handwriting did not match. The writing was that of an educated person. The language was that of an educated person. May God grant mercy to everyone who has ever sheltered in this darkness, and to everyone who chose to keep the light on for them. That was not the language of a farmer. It was the language of someone trained to write carefully. Crane asked Clarence if his father had ever had a partner, an associate, or anyone closely connected to the property who knew about the room. Clarence thought for a long time. There was a man, a minister. He served the area around Loyal from about 1845 to maybe 1858. His name was Alden Price, a Welsh family originally from Western Virginia. He was educated, studied theology somewhere, though he was never formally ordained. He simply called himself a minister. Clarence paused. He was a friend of my father. He visited the property many times. He knew about the room. Crane later found the handwriting of Alden Price in the records of the Methodist congregation at Loyal, in the minutes of several meetings written during his time there. The handwriting matched the documents from the box exactly. Alden Price had kept the records of the room's use. He had written the letter, he had known the routes, the contacts, and had managed the practical details of what Rufus Slagle had built and others had used. Alden Price left the county in 1857, and according to all records Crane could find, never returned. The small journal from the box, with its notes of routes and initials, turned out to be clearer than it first seemed. It required a key, which Crane eventually worked out with Walter Harwick over several evenings. Once understood, it revealed a careful record. 17 people over 7 years. From 1847 to 1854, the entries were short: a date, a set of initials, a direction of travel, and sometimes a note like "arrived well" or "continued 2 days," and in 3 cases, a small mark that Crane and Walter agreed likely meant uncertainty about the outcome. 17 people, men and women, and in at least 2 cases, including the child whose cross still lay in the soil of the second room, children, mostly from Virginia based on the directions, moving north toward river crossings in central and northern Kentucky, and from there toward Ohio, toward Indiana, toward whatever life they could build, beyond the reach of the laws that had once claimed ownership of them. Crane could not identify any of the 17 from initials alone. There were no cross-references, no extra records, no clear way to know which of them, if any, had reached their destination. He wrote to contacts in several counties in Ohio and Indiana, describing what he had found and asking if any local records showed people from that time and place who had settled there. Over the following months, he received 2 replies showing cautious interest, one from a clerk in Athens County, Ohio, and one from a minister in Shelby County, Indiana, but neither could be firmly connected to the Harland County room. The 9 safe arrivals mentioned in the letter remained unconfirmed. What could be confirmed, and what Crane carefully recorded, was the physical evidence: the room, the tunnel, the second room, the sleeping platform, the stove, with hidden ventilation, the wooden box and its contents, the cross in the ground. He wrote everything down in the official county log in clear, steady language, knowing that the record itself was a responsibility. He included the statement from Eleanor Harwick, her account of what she had suspected and when, and the difference she made between suspicion and knowledge. He included the statement from Clarence Slagle, who came willingly and gave a full account of what his father had told him and what he knew himself. He added the transcriptions from Court Harwick's journal and the confirmed handwriting match, identifying Alden Price as the writer of the documents in the box. It was the most complete account anyone could produce 30 years after the events, of a small, informal station hidden in the mountain roots of the pre-war South. It did not explain everything. It could not name the 17. It could not confirm the 9. It could not find Alden Price or determine where he went after 1857. But it established what had happened in that house, and it showed a detail Crane returned to again and again in the years after he closed the case, that it had been done quietly, without formal organization, without official support, without recognition, in silence, in the cold and dark, by ordinary people who chose to open a door. The investigation officially ended in August of 1887, 5 months after George Puigt lifted the floor panel in the dining room. Crane's official report filled 37 handwritten pages. He filed it with the county court, kept a copy for himself, and gave Eleanor Harwick a summary. Eleanor read the summary at the kitchen table, with Nora beside her, on a warm afternoon late in August, with the windows open and the soft sound of the creek coming up from below the ridge. She read it without making any comment, turning each page slowly and carefully, her face steady in the way it always was. When she was done, she folded the papers neatly and placed them on the table. 31 years, she said, and I sat and ate my meals above that room for 31 years. Nora looked at her and asked, "Does that trouble you?" Eleanor thought about it seriously, not avoiding the quay. "Stian, no," she said at last. "It does not trouble me. What troubles me is that I did not know. What troubles me is that Court could not tell me." She paused for a moment. "He did not tell me because he did not trust that I would understand what it meant. Or maybe because he believed that knowing would be too heavy for me. Either way, he carried it by himself for 30 years, and now he is gone. And the people who stayed in those rooms are gone too, and the only person left to speak about any of it is an old woman who knew nothing you suspected." Nora said. "Suspecting is not the same as knowing," Eleanor replied. She stayed quiet for a long time. "The child in the second room," she said softly. "The child buried in the ground at the end of that tunnel. That sea.